Hey.
All right, and we're live. We are here with Jason, Staff Developer Advocate at Datadog. Welcome, and thank you for being here, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so first of all, we were just talking about it before we went live. What's with your social handle, Git Bisect? What is it?
Yeah. So I do have a separate handle, which I don't use. Primarily was on Twitter. But basically, when I started into developer relations, I realized that a lot of the things that I was posting on my own social media was very personal. So I wanted to create like an alternate account for my job. And so obviously then it's like, what should I use as a handle? It should be kind of tech related. And I was looking at all things, and with Twitter back then, it was still the 140 characters. So it's like, how do I make it shorter? And I found that Git Bisect was open, and Git Bisect is very polarizing. Either people know about it and they love it, or people don't know about it. So if you don't know about it, it is something that is extremely handy. It is basically a binary search to help you find problems. So if you have a Git commit and you merge that code and suddenly your code is broken, you're like, oh no, what happened? What went wrong? And especially in a large organization where there's lots of commits, you're like, cool, let's figure out where it last worked. And then you can run Git Bisect on that last commit and your current commit, and it'll divide it in half and pick that point and ask you, does the code work at this point? And you say yes or no. And if it's yes, then it'll subdivide, more recent stuff. If it's no, it'll go back, between the last working and that, and subdivide again and ask you again, does it work? And through that binary sort of search, you're able to figure out which commit is where your software actually broke. So super, super handy. I think it's a cool tool, and it kind of goes along with what we do in developer relations, right? And that's helping people find problems and hopefully overcome them.
Yeah, it is in a way a niche thing, but it is still, I would say a mainstream piece of tech for software engineers. That I find that interesting because you're working at a data company, but then it sounds like you have this software engineering background too.
Yeah. So a little bit of my background, I was a full stack software engineer when full stack meant that, you wanted to make a web page, and that meant installing Linux and doing a bunch of sysadmin stuff to install a web server, and then eventually getting to the point of actually writing HTML. And at that time, Perl was probably the most common language for any sort of dynamic thing. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into tech, and it really worked out well. So Datadog, the company that I work for now, is an observability company, which means we help everyone across the spectrum, from your sysadmin or your operations SRE teams troubleshoot infrastructure issues, all the way up to your front end developers who are trying to troubleshoot their front end code. We've got products for that. So it's actually been a really good fit. And as the company's grown, a lot of the products still are areas that I've got experience with and have a deep passion for.
Cool. I'm actually looking at LinkedIn profile and your Twitter profile. It's very interesting to see your sort of whole history. One thing that stands out to me is that you're not active on Twitter anymore.
Correct. Yeah. Like many people, I think Twitter had its day, and it was a really great place for a lot of people in technology to connect and share what they were doing and what they were learning. Unfortunately, as many folks have seen with the way the modern world is going, bad actors, people that maybe are espousing positions that actually, sort of worsen the divide between the people that have power and the people that are underrepresented. I think Twitter generally as a platform has started to be taken over by a lot of those bad voices. And so, like many folks, I've kind of fallen off of using Twitter. These days, if you do want to find me, Git Bisect works for LinkedIn. That's primarily where I post. I do other social media that tends to be more personal, so maybe not worth sharing, but if you happen to find me elsewhere, then great, feel free to connect.
Cool. Just quickly, I'll say hello back to someone on LinkedIn who said hello from North Carolina. Hello back to you. And Denny as well from Twitter X, we were just talking about that. So Twitter is not necessarily for developer advocates then.
Yeah, I would say, social media isn't really necessary. It really depends on what you're doing for developer advocacy or relations. We had chatted about this before actually, coming and starting the session, but there is what is the definition of developer relations or developer advocacy. And so, that does play into is social media necessary, right? And in my thoughts, it really depends on what you're doing. And for a lot of what we would consider developer relations, social media isn't. And you don't have to be that always out there public persona that's trying to build a following or get followers, which I think is great for the industry and in general for people, being able to become a part of the industry without maybe wanting a lot of that maybe oversharing of personal information or constantly being on social media.
Right. So I guess I should ask, since you mentioned the question yourself, what is developer advocacy?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I think there are lots of folks that have the notion of advocacy. Well, it means that you're advocating either on behalf of your users or, sort of advocating for product usage. I think sometimes we get a little bit maybe too pedantic about the wording of, advocacy versus evangelism versus developer relations. Because I think it's overall, there's a pretty wide umbrella to what we're doing. And so ultimately for me, the what is it comes down to really three things. And that's number one, what does your company or your boss want, right? Because you're employed somewhere. And so that's pretty important. If you're not doing what your boss wants, you're probably not going to have a job for very long. But then beyond that, there's sort of the understanding of what does your company do and what do they need? And that oftentimes isn't exactly the same as what they've asked you to do. And so I think the longer that you have a career, the more you start to figure out that what does my company actually need, and figure out where you fit in with that. And then I would say the third and maybe the most important part is what does your community need? And that takes some definition of what is your community? What's the group of technical folks that you're trying to help or enable or support, and what do they actually need? And so it's a long-winded answer to say, it all depends. There is no set definition for developer advocacy, but it's this combination of those things of what are you asked to do, what does your company need, and what does your community need, and finding that niche. And so that's why, social media, you being out there, constantly talking about what you're doing or promoting things on social media, that may be what your boss asked you to do. It might not be what your company actually needs. And to be honest, it probably isn't what your community really needs, right? If you think about the people that you're serving, they probably are more in need of education or enablement in some way, allowing them to do something. And if you ask yourself, could that be social media? It might be, but I think if you were really to dig into it, it might be something else. There's probably something that you out there, whoever's watching, you're probably really good at something technical and you can teach them something. And I bet if you really dug into it, it's probably not the most optimal way to share that through social media. There's probably other ways that you're really good at sharing or teaching. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that, you mentioned how what let's say your employer, your boss asks you to do, sometimes it's different from what the company needs or what the community needs. I kind of feel that, especially with social media, because, you might do a great job of managing a social media account for a company, getting, let's say, 100,000 followers. But, what does that mean, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What is a follower? I mean, there's a lot of these things, and, around, what is the goal, and what are you measuring?
Yeah. So what do you measure as, as a developer advocate, developer evangelist? Are there any particular metrics that you like to look at?
That's a really good question. And I generally, so a sort of funny thing, right? Datadog being an observability company, we monitor everything and we have metrics around a lot of things. The interesting thing, I think, for us is that within developer advocacy, we tend not to actually focus on those really granular metrics like followers or engagement or things like that. And that's somewhat along the lines of like, what does your company need? And so for us, when we measure, a lot of it is more around, are we accomplishing the things that we set out to do? And so for us, we use a thing called OKRs, which is quarterly objectives and key results. And for us, success looks more like, are we setting out an objective? Are we defining something that we're going to do and able to articulate the value for the company? And then are we actually accomplishing that thing, right? And so that tends to be it's a less granular way of measuring, but I think ultimately it focuses a bit more on the impacts that you're making, rather than these small numbers that may or may not actually align with what the company wants to do. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it's maybe a little bit less intuitive, or it's a little bit harder to sometimes win over people in your company to adopt, because it's really easy when you're doing followers or clicks or whatever. It's really easy to track those metrics, and you can show a chart that's going up and to the right. Yes, we're increasing followers, but it makes it a little bit harder to actually tie that back and say, like, this is really good for the company, and articulate why, other than there's more awareness or whatever. But yeah, I think ultimately, like, having some more longer term goals and some bigger goals, and then being able to articulate the real impact of those, and then just measure yourself on whether you're accomplishing them or not, makes it a little bit easier actually when you're measuring things of like, yes, I accomplished this, and it helps you set those priorities.
Yeah, that's interesting to me, because, I thought like a way to measure your impact is through metrics, but it seems like you like to not focus on them too much.
Yeah, it's more about focusing on what you're doing, right? So the metric is, did I do it or not? Which is actually a very clear way to measure things. Much more clear, again, than followers and trying to tie followers or whatever back to the impact.
Right. And if it's possible for you, would you be able to share like what that OKR might look like? Is it like, I'm going to write, this many pieces of article, or, we're going to speak at these things? What does it look like?
Yeah, it looks exactly like that. So, for example, one of the things that the advocacy team at Datadog does is we write presentations that are able to be given by anybody in the company, right? So as the company's grown, and as the number of tech events in the world has grown, it doesn't make sense, to fly me from Portland, Oregon, where I live, to halfway around the world to Japan to give a talk. Also, I don't speak Japanese, so like that would maybe not be effective. But what's really useful is for us to have a team that is, that are experts and really good at writing talks, and then being able to train somebody who is in Japan to actually go and do that. And so one of our OKRs that we usually have is, how many of these talks are we going to write for this quarter, right? And so we'll have an objective of, writing a couple talks, or refreshing or updating some old talks that we've given, So that, again, is very tangible. We know that providing, giving educational talks is something that really has a great impact. But rather than saying, we want to have 500 people show up to that talk, which we have a little bit less control over, right? We can't necessarily control how many people show up at a conference, but we can control that we have a high quality talk that is engaging, that people are going to want to listen to, and they're going to learn a lot from. And so being able to write that talk has a high impact for the company. We know that, and we can measure that we've been able to write that many talks, and those are now available for anybody to actually present.
Cool. That's good to hear, because I'm actually in the process of starting a new developer advocate position, and I'll be in a position to kind of set the goals and everything, for my personal, I guess, OKRs, goals, whatever they might be called. And if there are output goals, you're right. It's really hard to control them. Whether it's like the number of attendees or number of followers, number of views. You can do things to kind of influence them, but you can't really control them.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious about like how that translates to business goals, though, because at the end of the day, at Datadog or any other company, I would imagine sort of management needs to decide that's it's a team that's important to the company, and it needs to exist, right?
Yeah. One of the things, we've been, I don't want to say lucky, but I would say that Datadog's founders have been particularly, I would say, wise, I guess, rather than lucky. And wise in the sense that as starting from being engineers and growing their own company, they've been very aware of what sort of impact various parts of the company have and where they want to invest that money. So early on, Datadog had built out an advocacy team. And so I got to join very early, but they knew that it was important, even though the direct connection or the direct metrics that you would have would be hard, right? Meaning that it's very hard to tie sales directly to an advocate giving a talk or writing a blog post or anything like that. You can sort of tie them together, but ultimately, I think what we do with education is a very long sales cycle. In terms of, if I go out there and I educate a front-end developer on why they should be using real user monitoring, right? And the value of that, and what sort of metrics they should be watching for their application, that's great. And, it makes them better, which is a thing that I love, right? It makes them a better engineer. But if you track that, like me educating them on here's what you should watch and how you should think about web performance and et cetera, all the way back to like, as they build that understanding and they incorporate it, and then they spread that information to their team. And then ultimately, somebody in their engineering department signs a contract to get real user monitoring. That's a very long process. And so it becomes really hard to track, because in that long process, that might take a year or 2 years or longer. They're also talking with other people, right? They're going to be talking with, maybe at their local meetup, they'll meet somebody that also is on that same journey or has adopted the same practices or practices that they're looking to adopt. And there's a lot of these inputs. So it's really hard to say over a 1 year or 2 year time span of like, yes, like that sale is directly attributable to the talk that you gave, way back when. That stuff, because it's so hard to measure and there's so many different factors, it similarly becomes that thing of like, well, do you actually want to measure that? Or do you just want to go proceed with the understanding that what you're doing does have an impact? It isn't a factor in what people are doing. We don't know that it was directly involved in these individual instances, but we know in aggregate that what you're doing with education is beneficial. And so we're going to invest in that. So, overall, again, long answer to the short thing saying that like if you're trying to go after impact and you're understanding what the company needs, and you're working towards that, you're going to make an impact. So just trust that, right? And again, focus on whether you're accomplishing those and knowing that they will lead to an impact versus maybe the more granular things of trying to make these smaller things that maybe aren't really actually what the company needs.
Right.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to hear that, sort of, Datadog management is aware of this and they're supportive of your entire team, it sounds like. Is it under marketing?
We are not, actually. We're under product. And so basically, my manager, who's our VP of community, reports directly to our chief product officer.
Nice. I think, depending on where the DevRel team, kind of sits down under, it's kind of framed differently and you tend to look at different things.
Yeah. Traditionally, I've seen developer advocacy or developer relations fall under either marketing, product, or engineering. And product and engineering are generally somewhat similar. Marketing is definitely where you start to maybe bleed over, and some of your metrics tend to look a little bit more like traditional marketing metrics, right? And thinking about the sales funnel or the marketing funnel, which for those who might be watching, maybe if you're not familiar with that, that's something that you should learn. And the marketing funnel is the idea that, at the top level, you have a very broad reach, right? And so the idea is that's where you're introducing people to your company and your product. And, that sort of narrows down of people that maybe your product isn't applicable. And so you sort of lose those people. So there's a smaller subset of people where your product is applicable and can help them. And then there's a smaller segment of people who actually have the ability to buy your product. And then ultimately that leads down to the people that do buy your product. And so understanding that marketing funnel and where you sit in it for DevRel, especially if you're under the marketing team, that's very important. And that will influence what metrics you actually track for what you're doing. And that could be very different then from impact, right? Because you roll up into marketing and they're thinking of this funnel. So they're thinking of the individual steps and where you would fall into that. And so, yeah, it has a lot of effect on what you do and how you do it.
Definitely. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to quickly go through comments, and then I have a question for you after that.
Yeah.
So Pedro is saying the intersection between the organization's interests and the community needs. Love it. Thank you for the comment. Nate says, happy Friday. Happy Friday to you too.
Happy Friday, Nate.
A couple comments here. And what I wanted to ask is, you mentioned educational content, but, since you're a developer advocate at a company, most of the time, I think that's how developer advocates work. You need to mention the company's product. So how do you balance, general education, maybe about the problem space or about kind of the general concept versus, the specific product?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think it's always a very delicate balance, right? So for me, the way that I approach education is anything that I'm teaching, somebody should be able to learn something and actually be able to do it without using Datadog, right? Without our product. Because ultimately, I think that we have a very good product. And so if I teach people how to do something, they're naturally going to ask, well, what tools should I use? And maybe they have something. But because I think we have a very good product, it's always going to become one of their considerations, one of the options that they look at. And so I will then leave it up to our salespeople and other people to define exactly maybe why they should use our product over others. I mean, I could also articulate that, but I try to keep myself a little bit more neutral and play more to enabling developers and educating them on the practices that they should use and how they should do things rather than the specific tools. And then if they want to know about the specific tools, I'll dive into that. But ultimately, again, focusing on enabling developers to do what they need to do rather than the tools. Because, in my viewpoint, what makes tech really great isn't the tools. Like it's the people, it's the engineers, it's the developers. And that's where I want to focus my energy is making developers better.
Right. And I'm sure, the community appreciates that more than just like, talk entirely about, a particular product that can sound or, come off as more salesy.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other nice thing about that too is if you're in the role, if you're trying to align more with the community, it gives you the ability to do that sort of classic advocacy of understanding what they need and bringing that back to your product teams and your engineering teams and pointing out the problems of the product and helping them fix it so that you do have a really good product that you can believe in and stand behind. And then ultimately that feeds back, right? So if I teach a user, again, use the RUM example, right, of real user monitoring, I teach them and they start to get into it and they're like, oh, how would I do this, right? They have an example and it's like, oh, maybe my product doesn't actually do that in the way that's useful for them. I can take that back to my product team and be like, hey, here's a need that I'm seeing in the community. Can we update the product to work in a slightly different way or add a new feature? And then when they do that, I can actually bring that back to the community, be like, hey, that problem that you had, we now have a solution for it. Give it a try. Tell me what you think.
Right. I think, when it works well, it creates a really good cycle, like you mentioned. Because when the product is better for the community, then you're able to advocate for it, more easily too. And, throughout the conversation, I noticed that you seem to naturally have this ability to kind of break down things, teach things, maybe put yourself in shoes of different people, at different expertise levels. How did you learn to do that?
That's a great question. I don't know actually how I learned to do that other than it definitely takes practice, and a lot of empathy, I would say. Part of it for me, I feel like I've been lucky because I am much older than I look and I got into technology very, very early on. So I first learned to code when I was a kid, and this is going to be like mid 1980s. And so, I've been in technology for a while. And as part of that, I'd mentioned, early on in the day, building a website wasn't just writing HTML, right? It was finding an old computer, installing Linux, installing the Apache web server, probably realizing that there was a library you needed. And in order to incorporate that library, you needed to recompile the Linux kernel. And you did all of this what we call yak shaving, these prerequisite tasks in order to just get a basic website up and going, right? And that's sort of evolved. And so I think, I've been lucky enough to have such a broad experience throughout technology that I can understand their perspectives of people all across the stack, whether that's front end or back end or infrastructure. And so that naturally has given me a little bit more empathy or a closer empathy, I think, for people because I have those experiences. That said, I would say, for folks nowadays, when you go into technology, no matter what part of the stack you're in, try to be more curious, right? Try to learn about other areas of the stack that are different. And it's going to be uncomfortable. And really, I would say embrace that uncomfortability, right? I always like to say that most of the times when I'm in a meeting at Datadog, I'm probably the dumbest person in the room. And I like that, though, because it means that I have huge opportunities to learn. And so I think embracing that learning mindset will help you understand more and gain empathy for users across the spectrum. And as you do that, you'll start to naturally, tune into what do they need, because now it's the thing as you're learning that you understand that you would need. So yeah, I think that's the one way to do it. Keep a learning mindset. Try to be the dumbest person in the room.
I really like that. And I think good point to go into this question by Danny. If I understand it correctly, what she's asking is basically how do you balance your own personal learning versus creating content for your company?
Yeah, that's always a delicate balance. It's always best if what you're learning is stuff that you're interested in. And so, I would say opt for that. Obviously, if you're in a company, they have certain needs. So you might need to learn things that aren't so interesting for you. But take that as an opportunity, right? Like learning anything is always good. Whether or not it's a topic you're super passionate about, learning is learning. And the more you learn, the smarter you get. You may find, and I found a lot of times that the things that I'm not interested in, actually, when you start to dive into them and you start to learn, you'll find little bits that are actually really interesting to you, right? That you didn't expect, because you go in with a lot of unknown unknowns, meaning you don't know what you don't know. And as you expose the things that you don't know, you will inevitably find things that are interesting that you didn't know about that you want to dive into more.
Right. So it sounds like being open-minded is kind of important.
Yeah, definitely. Be open-minded. Just be willing to learn anything.
All right. I want to address a couple comments here. Sam is saying, I love that comment, being the dumbest person in the room. I think it's two things the way I see it. One is, literally being the dumbest person and kind of being willing to learn from them. And the other that I kind of suspect is just, your humility, kind of acknowledging that you don't have to know everything and you can't know everything.
Yeah, exactly. It's, and again, I think I've been very lucky to land at Datadog. We've got a corporate identity, and humility is one of those, right? And so, I think if I pull up the Datadog identity, there's other things like being enthusiastic about what you're doing. And so, I think, you as, you said you're starting a new position, or for anybody out there, I know a lot of people are looking at getting into DevRel and finding careers. And it's also an interesting time where there's a lot of, there are a lot of folks out there. It's maybe a little bit difficult to find jobs. And a lot of people get frustrated when they go through an interview and it doesn't work out. One of the things to keep in mind as you're doing this is there's a personality to every company, right? And there's your personality. And so oftentimes when people are looking for jobs, one of the things that I like to remind people is that you're going to be representing a company, and it's not just about your skills, right? Don't get discouraged if a company says no to you. It's probably not that you are not technical enough, or that you don't write good content, or you don't speak well, or any of those things. With what we do, it's almost like dating, right? There's got to be a good match between your personality and the company's personality. And sometimes that doesn't work, right? Just different personalities. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person or that you're not skilled. And it doesn't mean that the company's bad, and doing wrong things. It's a matter of alignment. And so, as you're looking for DevRel jobs, advocacy, evangelism, whatever you're calling it, keep that in mind, right? Be true to yourself. Don't shape yourself around what that company is. There's companies out there that have very playful brands, and they're very, comedic. And if that's not you, if you're a little bit more serious and reserved, it's okay. You don't have to represent that brand. And similarly, like maybe they shouldn't hire you. Find something that fits for you, right? If you're more serious, find a company that has that more serious approach. If you're more playful, go for that. But ultimately, whatever that is, I think there's some foundational levels of, one is that humility, right? Understanding that you're teaching people, but you don't know everything. And so be willing to learn all the time, be excited about what you're doing, right? No matter what it is, you got into this, you have passions in tech, pursue those passions, always be excited. Those are two really big things that will contribute to your success.
I really like that advice. I'm curious, since people aren't asking, but they might be kind of wondering, because I know that in my audience there are a lot of people who are kind of in the process of getting into DevRel. So do you have any advice for them?
Yeah. I'd made some notes because you'd sent this one before, and let me pull this up because it's worth me remembering to cover everything. But how to go about becoming a developer advocate or getting into DevRel. Number one, I would say, like, be a good engineer, right? Focus on that first. Like, you need that technical understanding. One of the challenges that I've seen in people wanting to jump immediately from, for example, graduating from a code school to becoming a developer advocate, is that you don't really have a lot of production real world experience. And so I'd say you can do developer advocacy, you can do developer relations without actually having the formal title. And so if that's you and you're just starting out, you're like brand new to tech and you're like, that's what I want to do someday, say, don't try to skip over those formative years. Like, spend some time becoming a good engineer, because those experiences will eventually become the solid foundation for you getting into developer advocacy or DevRel. When I say that engineers can be doing that role without the title, it's because a lot of folks get involved in communities, right? So go to your local meetups, go to conferences, become involved, because knowing the community is another huge side of developer relations. And so that's how it started for me, right? I was an engineer. I was a web developer, primarily doing PHP work. And so I got involved in communities, in the local PHP community. I was doing Drupal at the time, which was a PHP CMS, got heavily involved in that. And so building that foundation of being a good engineer and understanding your community is absolutely vital. Beyond that, I would say, work on your storytelling skills and your educator skills, right? Learn how to tell good stories about the work that you're doing, and focusing on how to communicate and educate people on technical things. So for me, that's sort of the foundation, right? Be a good engineer, get engaged in community, work on storytelling and education. As you start to grow in your career, then you can start adding more of the other skills, that'll help you get better. But those four are the foundation for you.
Cool. I appreciate that. And for people who are in the audience who are a bit more experienced, how do you go from let's say junior developer advocate, kind of starting to developer advocate, to senior to staff?
Yeah, that's also a great question, because I feel like in a lot of companies, people get very stuck into what they do, right? They started out and they're going to conferences and speaking. And so how do you get better at that, right? What does it look like? Do you just speak more? Or, if you're doing the social media thing, do you just get more followers? And I feel like that's an easy trap to get into, and it sort of gets you stuck and prevents you from advancing. And I say that in a similar way to like engineering. I think people often forget that advocacy is very, very similar to engineering, right? If you're an engineer, how do you get better at becoming an engineer? It's not really writing code faster and shipping more code, right? If I were to ask any of the folks watching, like, how do you become a better engineer? You'd probably answer things like, well, it's not about how much code you produce, right? As you get better as an engineer, your code gets maybe more performant, it's more reliable, it's more maintainable, right? And so you start to think senior engineers are the ones that aren't just writing code, they're writing the documentation around their code, right? They're getting involved in the planning, right? Of, we're going to roll out a new feature. Let's get involved in the planning. What should the architecture look like? What are the features that we need? How do we design the API? And I think that it's the same for advocacy, right? It's less about how much are you speaking, and you start to think more about, again, the impacts of what you're doing, right? How can I tell the story better? And then beyond that, right? If we think about maintainable or operatable code, how do we scale this out? Because I can't travel to every single conference that's out there. So how do I replicate what I'm doing and get that information out there and educate more people beyond me just showing up and giving a talk? And then depending on the company, it starts to grow even more, right? So at Datadog, we've got over 24 different products, right? We started off with just basic monitoring, we've grown. And so for us, becoming more senior becomes, do I understand the portfolio? Like, how many products am I very familiar with? How many different domains can I talk about? And it's sort of the same, if we tie it back to engineering, staff level engineers aren't just thinking about their service or their particular application. They're starting to work with other teams and build that cross-team collaboration. So at Datadog, our staff engineers are, there's probably a particular area, but they're working with a few different products. They're talking across the org, with infrastructure or with our storage systems like data stores, databases, right? They start to get a much broader reach. And so it's the same, I think, with advocacy is, starting to get a broad reach on what you're talking about, the products and the communities.
Right. I really like that. And, to me, it sounds like it comes down to how much value you're kind of giving to the company. And, what I'm hearing is the difference between, let's say, senior to staff is, or from, junior to senior, it might be like more independence, better speaking ability, better kind of technical abilities, all these things. And then from senior to staff, it's more than just that. Maybe it's having expertise in different areas and being able to, help people become developer advocates themselves, all of these things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I would say, again, it's similar to any other role within an organization. The more senior you get, the more it's focused on what are the impacts that you're making rather than just your individual skills.
Right. All right. I think we can address maybe this comment from Crab, the DevRel on Twitch. He says, like the list, want to add, create video content. So this is about getting into DevRel. It was a thing I was lacking, and it often hurt my chances as video is high demand for social media.
Yeah, video is very interesting. I went really deep into video during the pandemic because obviously there weren't any conferences to speak at. And so my notion behind video is maybe a little bit different than this, right? I don't do a whole lot of social media, so I wasn't going for the TikToks or other things. For me, I ended up going pretty deep into long form video content because the thing that I saw was, conferences went away, video came because there were no conferences. And then at the same time, 2020, everyone was doing virtual conferences. 2021, I think everyone got burnt out. They were like, I don't want to join a video conference. Like, I don't want to watch someone just talk at me, because it's a different experience, right? When you're in a room and there's someone on stage, there's a different energy than just watching a video, like watching us right now. I'm glad that folks are still sticking around and they're engaged, but after 8 hours of that, it's maybe not so fun. And so at the same time, my notion was like, Netflix drops a new series that's super popular, or, thinking back in the day of binge watching other shows, like, why are people binge watching on the weekend, right? They'll watch 8 hours. I just binge watch Fallout on Amazon Prime. And I was like, that was a great show. And I sat for hours on the couch watching that. But at the same time, I wouldn't do that for a virtual tech conference. What's the difference? And for me, it came down to the storytelling, right? And I think that's one area that we need to get better at in DevRel is how do you make engaging stories that people just want to keep watching and learning from? So for me, that was that part of it. I do, because I have a degree in graphic design, I did a little bit of video work during university. So video for that, like the editing part became a bit easier for me, like, because it was something that I sort of had a background in. That said, for video stuff, if that's the question, like, how do you build that skill? To me, it comes down to the storytelling. And then just transferring that, learning, following other video makers. There's plenty of YouTubes from video folks, not just content creators, but there's really great video folks that work on Academy Award-winning films that are constantly sharing how they do editing, how they do coloring, etc. Like, follow those folks and actually learn from the pros in that area, because they'll teach you how to take the story idea that you have and actually make give you tips on how to convert that to video.
Right. Is there anyone in particular you recommend?
Yeah. For long form stuff, I particularly like a guy named Mark Bone. Mark is based out of Canada somewhere. He's a documentary filmmaker. He actually runs an online course that I haven't taken called Art of Documentary, and it's opened up for new students right now. Not getting any kickbacks from Mark. He doesn't even know who I am. But yeah, like, for me, a lot of it was documentary filmmaking is actually very similar to what we do with DevRel, right? If you're telling stories about how engineers solved a problem, right? Talking with those engineers, you're going to get a lot of different answers, in the same way that documentary filmmakers talk to their subjects and they have to do creative editing, right? What did that person say? And they'll take that and they'll edit it and they'll combine it with footage and produce something amazing that actually, good documentaries get you to learn about a problem or some aspect of the world that you didn't know about. And it gets you to feel and really like resonate with that and get interested in that. And so to me, it's very similar. So I've been focusing a lot on documentary filmmakers, watching them. So Mark Bone is one of them. There's a few out there. I'll have to come up with a list. Maybe we can publish that later.
Yeah, so that sounds great. It's interesting that, because I haven't heard anyone kind of put it that way. I don't even know how you would even go about it in a technical context.
Yeah. I mean, going about it in a technical context, a lot of it for me was studying film basics. So during 2020, 2021 into 22, I was just reading a lot of books on, how do you make movies? How do you write for movies? How do you do documentaries? So there's a lot of really good fundamentals around that. A good, easy one that I love is there's a thing called the Story Circle. And the Story Circle was written by, I'm spacing on his name now, but it's one of the writers for Rick and Morty, for those that like Rick and Morty, or Community. The guy that came up with it is a writer for both of those shows. And he created a thing called the Story Circle, and it's sort of based on classic storytelling patterns. And so for me, that was one of the things that really hit home for me, is how do you take a character and follow them, and what are the things that build drama, right? And so you think about, person starts off, there's some sort of inciting event, some sort of thing that changes in the world that makes them need to do something else, right? And then they go on this journey and they learn things and they encounter problems and they look for help. And it ultimately helps them overcome whatever challenge they did. And they end up sort of back where they started, but they're changed. And so the world looks different to them now. And as I sort of learned about this, it very much applies to what we do in technology, right? Like, you're given a problem, there's a technical challenge, you need to solve it for a reason. You try different things, you bang your head against the wall, like, let me try this bit of code, let me try this solution. None of them work until finally something does. And oftentimes in there's the person, whether that's a coworker or somebody on the internet that helps you out, that gives you the pointer of like, have you looked at this, or have you tried approaching it this other way? And it very much aligns to a lot of these classic storytelling arcs.
Cool. I see the Dan Harmon Story Circle. I guess that's what it is, right? All right. Thank you so much. I feel like we've covered a lot. I personally learned a lot, and I hope the audience did too. Is there anything else you want to say before we end the stream?
Honestly, I would say, you mentioned that a bunch of the folks watching are interested in getting into developer relations or just starting their careers. And I would say, keep going for it, right? It's a very, very rewarding career. Because, again, you're helping a lot of people. And I think that while I don't think that every company needs developer relations or an advocate, I think that the industry as a whole does. The industry needs people like you who are out there who have a passion for educating others, for helping lift everybody up. And I think that's key, right? That's how we all move forward. That's how technology gets better, is all of us sharing. It's why open source is so popular. It's why, communities and foundations like the CNCF or other things like that. It's why they're so popular, because together, if we're all sharing and we're all learning from each other, then we all get to make better technology and we all get to solve harder problems. And so, if you're just starting out, if you're interested, don't be discouraged. Keep going for it. Get into developer relations or advocacy, even if it's not formal. Again, be a good engineer, get involved in your community, all of that. Yeah.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect note to end this on. So thank you so much, Jason, and thank you everyone for tuning in.